Good afternoon, GFE! I'm Gregg Behr. I'm Executive Director of the Grable Foundation, and I'm your outgoing board chair. And after 7 years on GFE's board, this moment marks my last official function as a trustee. As you and I look ahead together to what's next for GFE, we should be incredibly eager and excited about what will unfold under the leadership of Celine, Caroline, and their colleagues on the staff and the board. Now, those of you that know me know that I hail from Pittsburgh, and you know that Fred Rogers is a hero of mine, both in childhood and as an adult. Fred Rogers was more than a guy in a cardigan sweater. He made kids feel loved, supported, and respected. And he was a disruptive visionary who noticed what was attractive to young people and sought to make what was attractive good. Next month, the feature film A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood will be released in theaters nationwide. Starring Tom Hanks as Fred Rogers, the film documents the real-life relationship between Fred and journalist Tom Junot. There's already buzz about this movie, and it's likely to be a box office success, especially given the surprise haul achieved last summer by Morgan Neville's documentary, Won't You Be My Neighbor? It's clear that Fred Rogers has returned to popular culture and the public's consciousness, perhaps just at a moment when America needed to be reminded about his extraordinary legacy. Once again, people are looking to Fred Rogers for guidance. We can start, Rogers tells us, by listening. Listening is where love begins. Listening to ourselves and to our neighbors, he once wrote. It's by listening that we can come to understand, empathize, and work alongside one another to expand love and change the systems that divide us. Love. Love begets love, and justice, and worth. And isn't that really why we're all here? Isn't that why we do what we do? For every young person, and most especially for our black and brown children, for immigrants, refugees, and the undocumented, for rural youth, for girls, for those with exceptionalities, for the marginalized, for every young person who does not yet feel that they belong, that they matter, that they should have hope for their futures. That's why we do what we do. That's my charge, and it's yours too. And it's our commitment to those who will follow us. And that's the commitment, too, of this city of New Orleans. This afternoon, we have an opportunity to hear from two people dedicated to this place, both of whom are outstandingly original thinkers and whose work has impacted our nation, originating from Louisiana, their home. In a bit, Conference Committee Chair, GFE board member, and my friend, Amy Kerwin, will introduce Syrita Steib-Martin. And first, we'll hear from Walter Isaacson. He is a professor of history at Tulane, and he is the past CEO of the Aspen Institute, where he is now a distinguished fellow. He has been a chairman of CNN and editor of Time magazine. He is an author of books. He is a host of shows and podcasts. He is a scholar and a public servant. And it is my genuine honor to welcome to the stage Walter Isaacson.
Thank you all very much, and thanks for coming to New Orleans. If you want to do a conference on overcoming adversity, there's probably no place better to do it, especially when it comes to education. It was in this city that we not only had to overcome adversity, but we had to use adversity to try to be innovative and think different, as Steve Jobs would say, about how we were going to do education. We certainly didn't get everything right The people working in the trenches here in the education field are still revising, still trying to listen, still trying to improve, still trying to say, let's have some humility, and as Gregg said, or Mr. Rogers said, let's listen. But in the end, these are passionate, dedicated people who are trying very hard to do exactly what you're doing at this conference and what you do with your lives, which is to realize it's about something larger than yourselves and to realize it's about creating the opportunities for everybody that many of us were lucky enough to have. This ballroom, this place, this almost hallowed ground right here means a lot to me because after the hurricane, when the waters started to recede and the earth started to heal, before the school systems were even open, 2 or 3 weeks after the hurricane, this was one of the few places open. Xavier brought some students back. We met in this ballroom. Among the people who met were 200 or so core members of Teach for America who had been teaching in New Orleans, but the school system was shut. It was closed. It wasn't going to open until January, at best. And I was there, Wendy Kopp, a lot of people, Kira Orange-Jones, our wonderful executive director here, went around the tables and said, look, you can be sent to Baton Rouge or Houston or Dallas or the Delta, where you'll get paid because there's no schools here to pay you. Or if you want, you won't be paid, but we'll try to give you a stipend, and you can stay here and try to make sure the schools get reopened. There were, as I said, about 210 people sit in this room. One by one, they stood up. I'm starting to choke up here because I can visualize it. They said, I'm staying, I'm staying. And every single one of them stayed to try to reopen the school system of New Orleans and to try to overcome adversity. That's the type of spirit. That's the type of spirit and the passion of the people I get to write about, whether it's Ben Franklin, Albert Einstein, Steve Jobs, Leonardo da Vinci, now Jennifer Doudna, the great scientist, because they are people who learn and overcome adversity, and they become innovative because of it. You know, Leonardo da Vinci had the great good fortune to be born out of wedlock. Had he been not so, he would have had to be a notary, like his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather. But because he was freed from that and freed from the scholastic wisdom that would have come crammed into his head from one of the monastery schools, he got to help learn himself and be part of the informal academies that were springing up, not in the village of Vinci, but when he runs away and goes to nearby Florence. He was lucky enough to be born the exact year that Gutenberg opens his first print shop. So we see in young Leonardo's notebooks all the books he buys and all the people he works with. Leonardo da Vinci was somewhat of a misfit, or felt that way when he arrived in Florence. He was not only illegitimate, he was left-handed, he was gay, very outwardly gay, with a boyfriend, flamboyant, distracted, and yet he becomes embraced by the people of Florence, by the Medici family and others who are doing what you do, which is creating a new style of things where people who had had privilege created schools and academies and museums and libraries. So Leonardo da Vinci becomes sort of embraced by this community, showing that the diversity of a community, a place where people are coming from the Arab world because Constantinople has just fallen and they're bringing algebra so that he and Brunelleschi can figure out how to do the perspective of the dome. They're connecting engineering to art, to mathematics. And all of that makes it a cradle of creativity. And that's what a great education does, and that's what you try to do as you watch, even in this country, as we're having enormous, as you may have noticed, political problems. In local communities, though, there are real people doing real things and bringing people together in cradles of creativity, whether it be Detroit or Columbus or Nashville or Austin, I hope New Orleans, and even Chattanooga and Cleveland, Mississippi. I go to these places and people are trying to bring people together in a way that helps facilitate education because they know that leads to creativity. Ben Franklin's the same way. He's a 10th son of a Puritan immigrant, and it was going to be his father's tithe to the Lord. His father was going to send him to Harvard to study for the ministry. It's a long time ago when Harvard knew how to train ministers. But Franklin wasn't really cut for the cloth, so he runs away. I don't often get asked to speak at Grantmakers for education type events because whether it was Steve Jobs or Franklin or Leonardo, they all drop out of school and run away, which is not a good sign. But then they all realize the value of education, so when Franklin gets to Philadelphia, he creates a group, not quite like Grantmakers for Education, but they call it the Leather Apron Society, which is all the shopkeepers on Market Street who put on their leather aprons in the morning, and they get together to give grants and to try to start civic institutions. And what's the first one that they do? Well, actually, the fire department is, but the second one they do is the Academy for the Education of Youth. He takes exception to the people up in Puritan Boston that he had run away from, which says that education is for raising up the elite to be our leaders. He said, no, every student, every young person in Philadelphia, every apprentice, every artisan's child should all have an equal chance because education will raise up our whole community. He also creates the first lending library in Philadelphia, and when he does that, he writes in his autobiography that because we created the Academy for the Education of Youth and the first circulating library, the young of Philadelphia will be just as educated and have just as much knowledge and wisdom as the upper classes in the old world that we came from. And he said, and this was the essence of the middle-class democracy we were trying to create. So it has always been at the core of that. Now, the other thing we learn from adversity is a little bit of humility. We know that there's some things beyond our power. In fact, Franklin made a list of traits that the people of the Leather Apron Club were supposed to check off each week to see if they had mastered these virtues: industry, honesty, frugality, diligence. And at one point, Franklin had checked off every single one. He said he had mastered them. And he showed it around the room at the meeting of the Leather Apron Club, and one of the people there said, you know, Franklin, there's a virtue you kind of forgot. And he says, what's that? And the friend says, humility. You might want to add that to your list. Cool thing about Franklin is he's very self-aware. He said, I was never very good at the virtue of humility. I never mastered it. But I was very good at the pretense of humility. I learned to fake it very well. But here's the genius part. He said, I learned that the pretense of humility was just as useful as the reality of humility. It made you listen to the person next to you. It made you hear their criticism. It made you try to find the common ground. And that's what we were trying to create as we created each one of our new civic institutions. Even when he dies, he takes his entire estate, and it goes not quite to a scholarship fund, but a revolving scholarship fund he creates. One in which he gives loans to people who want to go to school, and when they pay it back, it becomes loans to them. And that revolving fund exists to this day, the 250 years. Some kids from West Philadelphia last year won the Something de Sol race, the Auto de Sol race, which is about solar cars and go-karts, from a inner city school in West Philadelphia with money from this Benjamin Franklin Fund. And so we see this notion of being innovative, coming out of adversity, is how we try to create new things. Now, in the world of education, it used to be a little bit less politicized, and people like you, I know, are not that politicized. But like the rest of our country, every concept, everything you try to propose in education now, there's a knee-jerk reaction, from the left or the right, or Democrats, Republicans, or whatever. What adversity taught us in New Orleans is that the need for good education and the need for great students wears no political label and no ideological label. It is part of who we are and of community. And nothing helps reinforce your sense of community, your sense of being in the same boat, than when the waters start to rise after the levees break. And so, as I said, with the humility that is either real or, like Ben Franklin said, sometimes here, the pretense of it, I've watched the kids and young people who came through the new school system get some things wrong and some things right, but each year try to innovate based on data. Ben Franklin always wrote, when they were trying to figure out how to do the right curriculum, how to do the right thing at the library, he said, let's hear the arguments and then let the experiment be made. He does that even when he figures out that sparks are like lightning. Let the experiment be made, using that method of saying, let's try some things out and see and be open-minded about what might work, whether it be science or governance or the creation of the Academy for the Education of Youth. As I say, there were heroic people. One of the things that makes, as to use a Ben Franklin line, makes my blood boil exceedingly, is when people who are trying hard, people who were in this ballroom and go out, they're being accused of things like privatizing things in some cases. And I know every one of those people who's helped create schools and helped create teachers' funds here. One of them, Ben Markovitz, who started Psi Academy, has a special needs child of his own, is always on the edge of, not having enough money for the health care. And yet these people are going out there sacrificing, raising money, and trying to do what's right. So even when people like that get some things wrong, I want us all to be a little bit more humble and to say at least they have the passion to be there in the arena and to try. When I came back, there were no schools in New Orleans. As I said, we met here. And a few of us went over to Houston. If you're from Houston, thank you. Nobody in New Orleans will ever close a door to you. If anything ever happens in Houston, we've got food in our refrigerator. We've got clothes that fit you in our closet. Because we all went to Houston. And at the Superdome, there was something called New Orleans West, which was an academy there in the dome for the kids for the first semester after the storm. Eventually it came back and became New Orleans West, even as it opened in FEMA trailers here. And we each went to the dome and met some kids and tried to mentor them and get them back. And I'll just tell you the story of one of them, Troy Simon. You may run into him someday. Some of you may have seen him. But he was a kid who right here, right across the street, Canal Street, in the French Quarter, was a pickpocket. His brother was in jail for armed robbery. He gets to the Superdome where I meet him, and he doesn't talk. And after a while, I figure out he's in 8th grade, and he doesn't know how to read, which is why he doesn't talk in class. He gets brought back to New Orleans. He gets put in Ben Markovitz's school, Psi Academy. Gerald Bryan becomes his teacher. And very slowly, with the help of enormous numbers of organizations, all the way from not only Teach for America and KIPP, but Posse and College Track, he goes through them all. And in the end, after 8th grade, going there illiterate, he gets into Bard College on a full scholarship. He's now at Yale in graduate school. And I talked to him when he came back just a month or so ago before the semester. I said, what do you want to do? He said, I want to be a 3rd grade teacher. So what? He said, because that's, the 3rd grade teacher had put some things in my mind, and it wasn't until I was in 8th grade after the storm that they sunk in. But if I can be a 3rd grade teacher, I can do the same thing. This is the struggle we are fighting for. And every single one of the people that I have written about realizes this notion that it's about something much larger than themselves. When Leonardo da Vinci, on his deathbed, after 16 years, he's still got the Mona Lisa. He's carried it from Milan to Florence to Rome, across the Alps to France, putting line after line in different, very thin glaze, because his science of understanding optics and understanding the nerves and muscles that touch the lips, he had this passion that he was going to create the world's most amazing smile. Steve Jobs always had that passion too, knowing that it wasn't just about making money. It wasn't just about the success. It was about the passion you had from connecting beauty to engineering. And education going forward is not just about STEM, it's not just about coding. It's about connecting creativity and connecting the arts and connecting beauty to engineering and the sciences. Whenever Steve Jobs launched a product, the slide at the very end of his presentation, iPhone, iPod, iPad, all had the street signs of intersection, which is the intersection, he showed it, of the arts and of technology. That's the type of thing that we're going to have to do in education in the 21st century. And what that takes is what Florence had and what Philadelphia had, which is a respect for diversity, a respect for different people from different places with different backgrounds coming in and bringing their own ideas, and often the friction that comes when people from different groups mix together. And that friction produces sparks, and as Ben Franklin taught us, sparks are just another name for lightning. So when we improve education, we still have another great mission, which is to preserve the diversity that used to be part of America's education. My dad, Moon Landrieu's dad, many others went to Lusher Academy. Lusher, then sort of back when our city really lost it in the 50s and 60s, became like any urban public school, and it kind of fell apart. Now Lusher is back, and one of the things they try to do, and maybe 15 or 20 of the other schools in New Orleans try to do, and the others have not been successful at doing, is making sure there is the mix, socioeconomic mix, racial mix, ethnic mix, that reflects the city. That's the next big step as we improve education, is to make sure that we understand that in our diversity is our strength, and that diversity is the fuel for creativity. The schools in New Orleans have not been perfect on that, but they're more integrated than they were before the storm, and they're more integrated than they were when I grew up. Astonishingly, one of the least integrated school systems are New York, Los Angeles, whatever. These systems have yet to find a way to bring us together and unify us as a nation. And that ability to unify us as a nation through education, but also through throwing people together, like my dad when he was at Lusher, and my dad when he was on a platoon in the Navy in the South Pacific, throwing people together like that is the essence of making, as Ben Franklin said, a democracy that will be stable. So as we look at our unstable democracy, we can point to a whole lot of enemies, but we have to be like Pogo, and a few of you are old enough to remember who Pogo was, the cartoon character, who said, "We've met the enemy, and it is us." Because we haven't yet fulfilled that mission that Benjamin Franklin left us, to create the type of education systems that not only make sure every kid gets an opportunity, but that our society can be bound together. In New Orleans, it hasn't been perfect. Go see Psi Academy, go to Lusher, go to any of them. I hope you get a chance to get out there. Go to Travis Hill. Travis Hill, does anybody know where that is? It's in the Youth Detention Center next to Parish Prison. But real people, Stephen Patrick, a friend of mine here, is working there every day saying, okay, we have to even do it in Parish Prison and the Youth Detention Center. This type of passion to make this work is what's driving schools here, and I think driving the hope for schools around America. As I said, we've gotten a lot of things wrong, but the graduation rate since 2006 has gone from 54% to 78% here. The eligibility for TOPS fellowships, which is a state scholarship to go to university, has gone from 25% of graduating students to 47%. College entry has gone from 37% to 60%. The percentage of kids here attending schools that are in the lowest 10% of the state of Louisiana schools has gone from 62% in 2006 down to 8%. And the ACT scores have gone from 17 to 18.6. I could flip over my notes and tell you the bad things, the things that haven't happened, the school scores that have started to stagnate. But I say this to tell you that if you've got the passion and you got good people with good hearts who realize it's part of something larger than themselves, you can try to make a difference. During his lifetime, Benjamin Franklin not only helped create the Academy for the Education of Youth, and the Street Sweeping Corps, and the Fire Corps, and the library that was a backbone of Philadelphia. During his lifetime, he donated to the building fund of each and every major nonprofit in Philadelphia, from the hospital on. And he donated to the building fund of each and every church in Philadelphia. And at one point, they were building a hall for visiting preachers and speakers, circuit preachers and the people from the Great Awakening, but also speakers from different places. And he wrote the fundraising document. And as a grant maker, if you got that document, you would have funded it. Because the first line was, even if the Mufti of Constantinople were to send somebody here to preach Islam to us and to teach us about the Prophet Muhammad, we should listen, for we might learn something. And on his deathbed, he was the largest contributor to the Mikveh Israel Synagogue, the first synagogue in Philadelphia. And so instead of just his minister accompanying his casket to the grave when he died, all 35 ministers, preachers, and priests of Philadelphia linked arms with the rabbi of the Jews and marched with him to the grave. That's what they were fighting for when they created this nation. And that's what you all, and I hope we all, are still fighting for today. Thank you all very much for being here. And my friend Syrita coming up. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter, for your remarks. I think as grant makers, or as a grant maker, one of the things I most appreciated was the way Walter celebrated success while still admitting there's work yet to be done, and I think that that's something that I'm not sure we all do enough of in our daily lives, so I really appreciate that. We're going to shift gears now to another champion of overcoming adversity here in New Orleans. And I have the honor of introducing Syrita Steib-Martin. Syrita is the founder and executive director of Operation Restoration, a nonprofit that supports women and girls impacted by incarceration to realize their full potential. As you'll soon hear, she has an unrelenting passion to help women successfully re-enter into society after incarceration. At the age of 19, Syrita was sentenced to 120 months in federal prison. After serving 110 months, she earned her BS from LSU HSC, right here in New Orleans, and became a nationally certified and licensed clinical laboratory scientist. Syrita successfully drafted and passed Louisiana Act 276, which prohibits postsecondary institutions in Louisiana from asking questions relating to criminal history for admissions purposes. That actually marked Louisiana becoming the first state to pass this type of legislation. But Syrita wasn't done. She's working to further that work nationally and is working on the Dignity for Incarcerated Women campaign, regularly speaking at conferences across the nation about the experiences of incarcerated women. I'm honored to introduce Syrita Steib-Martin. And this is what an introducer never wants to do, is to say, hold up a minute, I forgot something. So what I'd like to share is that at the end of Syrita's remarks, she would like to take questions from the audience. So if you could please access your app, you'll have the opportunity to pose questions, and then we'll sit down and we'll have a good discussion about your questions. So please submit.
How's everybody doing after that amazing lunch? So since it seems like everyone is finished eating, I was afraid that people would still be eating and I couldn't ask you guys to stand up for me. So I would like everybody to stand up. Thank y'all for participating in this. So the reason why I asked you guys to stand up today is because I want everyone who is not charged with bringing higher education or education at all to underserved populations to have a seat. So everybody's still standing, right? So we could all say that we are starting this conversation in the same place, right? We all have a mission to make sure that people who don't have access to education receive that education. Okay, the second thing I'm gonna do, because I'm gonna get you guys in your seat. So anyone who has never been impacted in any way, shape, or form by incarceration, take a seat. Magically, almost the entire room is still standing, right? So we can also agree that incarceration touches a lot more people than we think. You can't tell who's been impacted by incarceration just walking next to them in the hall, right? Okay, everybody can sit. So as they mentioned earlier, I was incarcerated at the age of 19. At the time that I was arrested, I did not come from, I guess, the normal socioeconomic background that people associate with prison. My mom was a judge when I went to prison, and my father was a supervisor at one of the largest oil refineries here in Louisiana, Marathon Petroleum Oil Company. But what led me to prison is what still leads everyone to prison, I believe, women and girls, and that was trauma. I was abused physically as a child, sexually assaulted in my teenage years. So by the time I hit 19 and I was on my way to college, I had a full scholarship in physics and engineering to the university, Xavier University here in New Orleans. But at the same time, I was also headed on a road to prison. Ultimately, I did a year at Xavier, and then I joined the military because I was really, really, really smart, but I did not know how to study. And when I got to college, I found out that you must know how to study to be able to stay in college. And I tapped out, and I was like, you know what? I'm gonna go to the military, try to get some structure, or so I thought in my life. And then I would finish my college education after the military because I still didn't want to pay for college. So I was like, I'm gonna let the government do that for me. But myself did not have a conversation with anybody who could tell me that maybe going to boot camp was not the best idea for someone who suffered from PTSD at the age of 14. So when I got to boot camp, it was just horrible. So maybe about 7 months out of boot camp, I was in A school to train as an electronics tech in the Navy. I found myself arrested and in prison, and I was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, 20 years in state prison, $1.9 million in restitution, all for the same crime, and I was 19. I did not understand or comprehend what had just happened. I didn't know what was going on. I just knew I was really angry about it. When I got to prison, I was denied access to an education because I had a lengthy sentence. So I was unable to use the educational systems that were afforded to people who had shorter sentences or that were getting ready to be released. And that was problematic, so I ended up in about 6 institutions within the first 4 years because I was small, I wore glasses, I thought everybody was picking on me, and I was gonna fight first. So that's how I ended up in all those different institutions. But what happened was I was able to go to Tallahassee Correctional Institution in Florida, and Tallahassee Community College was coming in to offer courses while I was incarcerated. And I was nearing the end of my sentence. I had about 4 or 5 years left. And I was able to start taking classes while I was incarcerated. And what happened was I started learning how to know who I was. And you know, education has a powerful, transformative effect on you when you are able to start understanding education at a higher level. You also start understanding yourself at a higher level. So I was able to psychoanalyze myself and figure out what things I needed to stay away from, what were triggers that I needed to start healing from the trauma that I had experienced while I was growing up. So education did all of those things for me, but if my mom could not afford to pay for me to go to college, I would have missed out on that opportunity as well while I was incarcerated. So when I got out, I had everything set. I knew I was gonna go to school, knew I was gonna complete my educational journey. Once I got out, I applied to the University of New Orleans here in Louisiana and was denied the opportunity to go to school because I had to check the box on the application. So for the next 2 years, I floated from job to job. I didn't even have a plan B because I just knew I wasn't even, I guess, had the good sense that God gave me to be afraid or thought about, you know, what would happen if I couldn't access an education because I just did not know that I would be denied that. So 2 years later, I was married. I had a son. His name is Ethan. He's 8 now. And normally he's on stage with me, but he had to go to school today, so I chose him to go to school. But what happened for me was I really wanted to figure out how I could continue my education because I knew the statistics that were wrapped around kids of parents who had been incarcerated and the lack of education and what did I need to do. So before I went to prison, the internet didn't exist. When I got out, it did. I didn't know all the wonderful things that the internet could do. So I logged back into the University of New Orleans account and the application popped up. It was still there. And I was like, I don't have to fill it out again. I don't have to do anything. So all I did was uncheck the box and reapplied, and I got in. I got scholarships to go to school. Immediately, I started tutoring chemistry while I was there, and I knew that I wanted to go to medical school because that was my aspirations always since I was really young to go to medical school. And when I shared that with an education instructor inside a prison, he laughed. I mean, deep belly laugh, like it was the funniest thing he had ever heard. He was like, yeah, if you get into college when you get out, and you graduate, send me a picture. So, and I'll post it in the hall so you can be inspiration to the other inmates. I was like, okay, all right. Okay. So once I got into school, he became my bulletin board material. I was like, yeah, we're gonna do this and we're gonna do it really well. I'm gonna graduate with a 3.875. I'm gonna get a job. Yeah, okay. And I found him on Facebook, y'all. Found him on Facebook. And sent him a picture of me holding my diploma and my cap and gown with LSU behind me. And I was like, you can go on and post it now in the halls. But then he, let me know he wasn't working there anymore. So I had, did all of that for nothing. But what ended up happening was I knew when I had to share with the educational institution that I had lied essentially on my application, that it could be some repercussions, and I was just afraid, to tell them that I lied on my application. But what my professor said is that, oh, you're not like everybody else. So I'm gonna use me, for instance. Oh, that was loud. I'm gonna use me, for instance. Like, I have a lot of friends who have another race, I have a lot of white friends. And it would be like me telling my white friends, you're not like all the rest of the white people in the world, you're different, So that is the feeling that I had in that moment. And I was like, you're absolutely wrong. There are so many people who are incarcerated for whatever reasons, and they are so much smarter than me, so much better than me, and they deserve access to education. So I met Annie, my co-founder. She's in the audience over there, and the director of policy in the organization. And we set out on this trek to, change this and fix it. So I was speaking about my experiences. Some legislators were there, and they were like, oh, we want to write this policy. And we were like, okay. And then I never heard from them again, and we happened to be at the Capitol for our first time ever. And he was standing behind me, and he said, oh, I wrote this legislation for you. And I was like, for me? He was like, yeah, I heard you speak, and we wrote this legislation. And me and Andy were like, well, can we see it? And he was like, yeah, you can see it. And he showed it to us, and we were like, this is awful. It doesn't do anything, We were like, do you mind if we rewrite it? And he was like, no, rewrite it and I'll file it. So we started pulling legislation that had been tried all across the country from everywhere, copying and pasting and saying, this will work in Louisiana, but this won't work here, and figuring it out. And what came out of it was the legislation that they mentioned earlier that ended up being passed here, making Louisiana the first state to do so. And I have another colleague of mine, Stan Andracy, who ran the policy in Maryland. They technically passed it first, but their governor vetoed it, so we got it first. And then we've been working with Stan ever since, so they successfully passed it in Maryland. We've passed it in Washington. We've passed it in Colorado. And we'll be working on this legislation in 15 states over the next 2 years. But I'm really done. I hate talking about myself, so I'm going to end it in a few seconds. But, it's funny that Mr. Walter was up here talking about Benjamin Franklin, because I often talk about Benjamin Franklin as well. And I talk about how every institution that was created in this country pretty much came out of his living room, before he was an abolitionist. The oldest prison, the oldest hospital, one of the oldest educational institutions. And for lack of not a right or wrong thing, all of those things were framed to educate, to prison, and to heal white men, right? That's where we started. That's how this country started. And whether you agree or disagree, it's not even relevant. It just is. That's how it started. So if we are going about building our institutions and our hospitals and our prisons around things that were never meant to be inclusive, they will always be wrong. They will never be right. The things that we talk about when we say we want to address racism in this world, we've now created components of diversity and inclusion. And I'm just standing here to let you know, when you talk about diversity and inclusion, that does not check your box on racism. One cannot replace the other. We have to have conversations that do focus on diversity and inclusion, but we also have to have conversations about racism and talking about racism and talking about it in ways that everybody feels like they are comfortable and can say what they feel like they want to say. I take this constitutional law class. I'm a Nancy Marsiglia fellow, and we have people from different varying viewpoints. And, I had a gentleman, an older Italian gentleman. He was in class, and he was like, well, the world has changed so much. He was like, when I was growing up, we used to call black people, and he said the N-word in the middle of class, and everybody was like, and I was like, you're right. When you were growing up, that's how you refer to people. I said, but we can go out to dinner and sit down and talk about how you've come to the point of feeling like things have changed so much from then. Because all of us have a responsibility, even if it personally offends you, that you may be the only person that can show another individual some type of latitude and give them the understanding that they need so we can all come to the same place. We're never all gonna agree. We're never all gonna come to the same place at the same time, but what we have to be charged with is finding where our common ground is and making those things the best things that we can possibly make them at that time. So I am up here talking about higher education in prison. One of the things that my organization has been able to do, along with my amazing staff and other advocates across this country that we work with, is to have a partnership with Tulane University, where we go into the women's prison and we teach college courses. And because we know all institutions are built the same and we don't want to recreate systems, we started a model where we hold all of the educational funding inside of the nonprofit. We design the curriculum, we pay the professors, Tulane handles admissions, they waive tuition costs, and we have this great partnership that will now be in 3 prisons pretty soon, providing a bachelor degree granting program to people inside of Louisiana institutions for the first time ever, because the only degree in Louisiana that people were able to get prior to this program was a degree in ministry studies from the Baptist Theological Seminary, because they wanted to teach people how to become ministers inside of prison. So people who have really long sentences, that's what they had to do. We work on a federal level currently with the Unlock Higher Ed Coalition, where we are addressing all barriers to higher education for people who are incarcerated. And the big thing right now is restoring the Pell Grant to people who are incarcerated. And we've just had some really great endorsements, JP Morgan Chase and Verizon and all of these different people. I know Ed Council is in the room. We work with them really closely as well on these topics. But there are some great funders that are funding in this space and are doing it really well. They're funding higher ed in prison. And I just encourage you, if you haven't thought about it or you are about to think about it after you see me speak today, that you should really look at Ascendium and Laughing Gull and all these places that are really funding higher education, and specifically in the South, to bring education to everybody. The only other thing I really want to say is we have to start thinking about our world as one community. You can't think about your community as a community, your institutions as the institutions, and everything in a separate manner. Everything is so closely woven together that the world is existing as one big community. And the good things will trickle out, but the bad things will also trickle down. So we all have a responsibility to really look at how we can improve upon that and how we can make it better. I do like to have question and answer, because I feel like people can talk about and frame what it is that they want to hear from you. So I am going to call Amy back up. I hope you guys put some questions in the app so we can have a few question and answer sessions. So thank you for listening.
Thanks, Syrita. So I'm going to use moderator privilege and ask my question first. As Syrita mentioned, Ascendium is funding in this space. We're actually new to it. We launched our new strategy in May, and one of our 4 focus areas is increasing higher education programs in prison. We've come to this space through the help of my colleague Toya Wall, who has really helped us enter this space, I think, intentionally and respectfully. My question for you is, for those funders who don't have a Toya Wall on their team, what would you advise this group to do to really dive into the topic of providing funding in this space?
So my first thing would be contact Toya Wall. But the second thing would be to think about getting involved, but doing it in a responsible manner. The things that we really don't want to happen is people come into a space because they see something that needs to happen, and then you recreate the wheel. There are some really great things that are going on in the space of higher education in prison right now, and some really awesome programs that are doing things really, really well. Also, when we decide to pour money into systems, so DOC, for instance, it also changes the power dynamic of education. Like, you're not gonna ask DOC to run your college institution outside. They're not gonna come over and coordinate efforts on curriculum and programming and things of the sort on the outside, so it should be the same inside. So really focusing on how you can provide a quality education to students on the inside the same way you do on the outside. And also look at colleges that are going into prisons and providing programming. Is the access still open to the students once they finish?
Great. One question that I received was, where can this group find a list of the next 15 states where you're attempting to change legislation?
So I have a website. The organization is www.or-nola.org. And then you can go under the Unlock Higher Education campaign, and it will let you know all of the different barriers that we are trying to lift and focus on. And the 15 states are also there that we'll be working on. Oh, well, they will be. They'll be there when you go. Yeah, we're updating the website, but they'll be up. Because I'm the executive director, I'll make sure it happens. Within 24 hours, don't worry about it. It'll be fixed,
that trumps moderator privilege.
Yes, it'll be up.
Okay, next question. How do you work with institutions to adjust admission requirements and policies to be inclusive of the varied education backgrounds of people who are incarcerated?
There's this misconception that universities must ask about criminal history. It's actually not a law. It's not against the law not to ask, but it's this misconception that you must ask. So we could start there. So colleges don't have to ask if they don't want to ask, right? The second thing is that we know that there are real concerns on campus around campus safety, and the uptake on our pushback here in Louisiana was like sexual assault, that happened on campus. So the way that we talked about those things is like 50% of crimes that occur on campus are by non-students. And of the 50% that do happen, those students, that's the first time that they've ever committed a crime. So it's not the formerly incarcerated students that are, committing crimes on campus in the way that you would think, that it would be people who have been inside. We do know that we have statistics that say if a person just steps foot on a college campus, not even completes a degree, but just steps foot, the recidivism rate goes down to 21%. And if a person is allowed to get an associate's degree, it's 12%. A bachelor's degree, it's 6%. Master's, it's 4%. PhD is nothing. And it's approximate, because I know my policy director over there is like going crazy with exact numbers. So I'm gonna say approximately those percentages, right? So, but even though an outcome of educational attainment is not recidivism, because that's not one of the trackers that you should use, we do know that the access to education for that population definitely allows them to change their lives.
Great. Do you work with any organizations that also support the children of incarcerated women? The example that you provided about your parents being dedicated to learning was powerful.
So we do. We partner with a few organizations, but mostly our focus is on helping girls who are also in the system in the same way that the women are in the system. And then for those women who we know that are in the system, we work on reunifying them with their children and facilitating relationships. So education is one of the things that my organization does, but because we're one of the only organizations here in Louisiana that focus specifically on women and girls, we have 15 programs. We address everything that women, for the most part, struggle with so that they can have an education. So like another service that we provide at the organization is we have a Women's First clinic that helps women who don't have their high school equivalency to maintain that. But what we provide is childcare, we provide transportation, we provide a meal, and we do give like a scholarship to pay for them to take the test, because we don't want any barriers to stand in the way. Because what we find is that women actually do want to go to school, they do want to get a better education, but life is a barrier in of itself. So we try to remove as many barriers as possible so that women can focus holistically on education, because no one's going to focus on education if you have nowhere to sleep, nothing to eat, you don't have clothes to wear, and you can't take care of your kids.
Thank you. The policy play that you mentioned is definitely resonating with this group based on the questions. Can you share how easy or how difficult it was for you to navigate relationships with legislators? And what was your strategy to get in on their conversations?
So my strategy was, I didn't know it was a protocol. So they had ropes and things up in the legislature, and you're supposed to put in like a piece of paper to speak to this representative or that representative, because that was my first time there and I didn't know any better. I was the one who broke all the protocols. I'm like, hey, representative, such and such, and they came and they responded. But what we did was, the first time that we really worked on our successful piece of legislation, Annie went with all of her facts, and I went with my story, and we just knew that we had it, But the reality is, there was a lot of white men that were on the education committee, and they couldn't relate to me, and they didn't give a damn about her facts. They didn't want to hear it. So we had to regroup and think about, what could we do the next week to make these individuals hear what we had to say, because it was very, very important. So we found a white woman who had the same story that I had. And she went and she testified, and they cried and they stood up and they gave her a standing ovation, and they told her that she was somebody. And I looked at them and I was like, okay, if it passes, it passes. It's gonna affect black, brown, blue, purple, white, and green. I could not take it personal in that moment, because if I took it personal, then I was being selfish, because my fight is not for me, it's for all of the women who are coming behind me, and I couldn't be selfish in that moment. Now, I'm not gonna sit here and tell y'all I didn't go take a walk, because I did. I took a long walk. But what happened was, we were able to build some really, really good relationships after that, and the same Republican gentleman, Mr. Falconer, who's my friend now, who asked me why did I feel like I deserved an education over people who had never gotten in trouble. I mean, they ended up being like staunch advocates, and they testified on our behalf, and now they're like, anything you want to do, let us know, we support you. And any piece of legislation, for the most part, that we bring forth, we're able to pass it. And I hate saying bipartisan, because Louisiana is not bipartisan. We're about to be a supermajority in Republicans, which is okay, because we still got to work and pass legislation. But what it allowed us to do is to be able to work in any circumstance. So I'm excited about that.
Great. Do you connect with employers and encourage them to hire individuals who achieve degrees?
Yes. So before I stepped into the organization full-time, I was a supervisor at a hospital here in the LCMC family, and I made it my business to ask what the hiring practices were, what could we do to address those things and bring those things to the forefront. But there are a lot of formerly incarcerated folks who also have businesses. So my organization, we have 13 full-time employees, 18 contract employees, and 80% of my staff is directly impacted. So what we do is we find that we support one another, but I also am in conversations around saying, hey, I've been on both sides of the fence. I've hired in the hospital, and now I run an organization, and I promise you, the problems that workers have are the same. They're consistent. They're gonna call in, no matter if they're formerly incarcerated or not. They're gonna have children issues, whether they're incarcerated or not. So to think that you have to have a specialized way to handle people in the workplace that are formerly incarcerated is not the case. But what ends up happening is formerly incarcerated folks have so much more to lose. So they can't take those sick days off, and they have to support their children. And you're the only person who probably hired them after 15 rejection letters. So I find that people who are formerly incarcerated coming into the workforce are some of the best employees I've ever come into contact with.
Last question. How can young people become involved in your movement to unlock higher education?
So we need the young people on campuses mobilizing and holding their higher education institutions accountable, right? Like, young folks, parents pay the money, they have all the power. So if the students mobilize, they can get whatever they want to change. I know that young folks are gonna be our salvation. It's up to them. We have to invest in them, and we have to encourage them to be free thinking the same way someone invested and encouraged us when we were younger. But I think that the thing that the students can do is really pass along the information themselves in the same manner that we're passing the information at a higher place, because young folks listen to young folks, and they have a lot of energy, they have a lot of time, and they are just doing it. They have this technology thing down pat, so they reach 1 million people really quickly, you know? So I think that when students want to get involved, we have organizing groups that really focus on students as a part of the Unlock Higher Ed campaign. So if there are students in the audience that want to get involved, you can also go to the same website, and that's up. Just go to the volunteer form.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate you taking questions from us, so please join me in thanking Syrita.
Thank you. Great, thank you so much.